What's up, guys? Kevin Allen here, aka the Geek from DFS Army, and today we're taking a look at some strategies that are going to help us improve our daily fantasy football game. We're right around the corner from the start of the 2024 season. You could be watching this video at any time, but as I'm recording this, we're right around the corner, about to start the 2024 NFL season. And every year I like to go over techniques, approaches, basically anything we can to get an edge on the competition. And today I want to talk a little bit about game theory when it comes to daily fantasy football. Very specifically, we're going to get into the overall concept of game theory, and then we're going to dive a little bit deeper and talk about the most important part of game theory, ownership leverage when it comes to daily fantasy sports. So let's jump right into it and just the general understanding. What is game theory? You probably hear this all the time. What's game? Well, let's talk about it. In simple terms, game theory is the study of strategic decision making. It's used to determine the best strategies in competitive situations, like our daily fantasy football contests as an example, right? So in DFS, we use game theory to predict our opponent's moves and hopefully try to make optimal decisions that will help us improve our EV. Now, some of the concepts, and this is some broad stuff, I'll go into some definitions, some concepts, but some of the concepts around game theory, first one is something called Nash equilibrium. And Nash equilibrium occurs when all the players in a contest are making the best possible decisions, giving the decisions of others. In DFS, this means finding a balance when your lineup is either optimal or against optimal expected lineups of your opponents. Think of it like if you just click optimize on the DFS Army Domination Station Optimizer, you're effectively throwing in what is the most obvious or chalk lineup that you could possibly build in a contest. Now, I'm going to tell you guys right now, that will never win a tournament. Now, you might say, why? If I pay for great projections, that should win. I should be able to push the button and the optimal lineup should win a tournament. Listen, whatever you hope should be has nothing to do with reality. Okay, if you could just push a button and beat out 150,000 other people, then a lot more people will be doing it. But the reality is that when you understand how many people play in a tournament, a optimal lineup would never win it, because what you're looking for in order to win a tournament in daily fantasy football is not an optimal outcome, but rather an unusual outcome, a strange outcome. So we'll get into a little bit of that and how to really work that into your DFS lineups in a moment, but I'll go to one more definition here, expected value. You'll hear me talk about expected value quite a bit. What is expected value? The definition is expected value is the projected return of an investment or decision in the long run. In DFS, you aim to select players with positive EV, considering their cost, potential output, and ownership level. So cost, output, ownership, three components to EV. Next up, we're going to talk about leverage. What is leverage? Well, leverage involves gaining an advantage over your opponents by making decisions that account for your opponents and what they're doing. So effectively, decisions that your opponents are less likely to make. And in the simplest terms, that means choosing low-owned players that have some upside. There we go. And DFS means choosing low-owned players with higher upside. Now, I want to talk a little bit about ownership leverage, and then we'll get into the rest of this. But I prepared a little spreadsheet to explain why ownership leverage is so critical. Now, if you guys have ever watched any of my videos, especially my March Madness video, I like to bring this one up because the way I look at March Madness and filling out a bracket, think about it. You're filling out a bracket against 100 people, 1,000 people, 5,000, 20,000, but whatever, doesn't matter. You're filling out a bracket against a lot of people, right? We know who the favorite is because we can look at the odds and it tells you who the favored team to win the tournament is. The problem is we also know that that team will be selected by something like 30 to 40% of those brackets. So the minute you select the same winner as 40% of the other brackets, now I've got to beat 40% of the rest of their bracket in order to win the contest. That is not a good way to win contests, right? You're putting yourself in a difficult situation. Now I'm going to talk about my coin flip scenario. We've talked about this before. I've prepared this little sort of breakdown. I'm going to explain how this works. You're in a tournament and it's a $1 entry fee. And it's a very simple coin flip tournament. Think of it just like this. We're going to flip a coin 10 times. This coin is weighted 70% of the time to be heads. It's 30% of the time tails. So it's a weighted coin. Now you, as the entrant, you're aware of this. So your first thought is, wow, if it's weighted 70% heads, I should probably pick heads, right? You can only pick one, heads or tails. And you don't know what the rest of the field is going to do in this scenario. Second scenario, we know what they're going to do, but you don't know what they're going to do. So we get into the contest and 90% of the field chooses heads. Why? Because obviously the coin is weighted 70% heads. So it's going to hit heads more often than not. Now we do 10 flips of the same exact contest. And here's what happens. The first 9 times, the heads, or even the first 7 times, doesn't matter, or let's call it the first 7 times. The people who chose heads all win, except they're only winning $1.10 because they're all splitting a pool of $10. 9 of them chose heads, so they only win $1.10 each time. One guy chooses tails, he loses, he goes out with 0. But that's one spin. When we do 10 total flips and we hit the average, so 7 of the flips are heads and 3 of the flips are tails, look at what happens. The heads bettors, they win back $7.70 of the $10 that they've entered into that tournament. Only $7.70. So they're down $2.30. The guy who chose tails, and there was only one person who chose tails, he mostly lost. He was losing and losing and losing and losing, and then he finally won. But that one win made up for all the losses. So his decision to go tails, even though he lost more often than he won, was a positive EV decision, right? It was a plus EV. Where's plus EV? Yeah, there we go. It was a plus EV decision. So it felt terrible every time returning $0, $0, $0, $0. But then when it finally went tails, which the odds say it would hit tails 30% of the time, he won $10. And because it happened 3 times, he won $30. He spent 10. His profit is $20. So you can see here how important ownership leverage is in this sort of baseline case. That applies to DFS as well. So the first point that I want everybody to take away from this video is understanding that ownership leverage in daily fantasy sports tournaments is the single most important factor if you had to pick just one. But obviously, ownership alone isn't enough. We have to leverage ownership with an understanding of who the players are. So how do we leverage the fact that we, for example, at DFS Army have really great ownership projections for these players? Well, what we have to do is look at similar players at lower ownership that can provide leverage on the field relative to the high-owned guy who's also in a good spot. Remember back to our example here that this is the key point that I want people to understand. The key point is the coin was weighted 70% heads, meaning the people who were picking heads seemed like they were making the right call. Why would I pick the side that is only going to hit 30% of the time? Of course I should pick the head. So look at that like a player in a great spot who's projected really well. Christian McCaffrey is underpriced for whatever reason this week, and he's going up against a poor quality run defense, right? You're like, oh, all in, right? Let's load up on CM sizzles. Let's make that money. But here's the problem. If he's going to be 70, 80% owned, let's say in a showdown tournament, somebody like Christian McCaffrey might be 70, 80, 90% owned. So the actual positive EV play might actually be to fade him, even though he's in a great spot, even though he's underpriced, even though the coin is weighted to heads 70%, you might want to fade. You do want to fade that chalk. I want to talk about some other ways to leverage or to apply game theory to DFS. One of them is going to be identifying market inefficiencies. Now, what are market inefficiencies? These are situations where the public's perception of players or games doesn't match the actual value. An example would be where a player had a bad game last week, so now we think he stinks. Or vice versa. A player had a great game last week. I mean, how often do we see in DFS, everybody flocks towards the player who had a big game last week? We always think what we saw last week is going to happen again. Once again, if we want to actually win these tournaments, we need to be thinking about, we need to understand that our opponents are doing that. So we need to pivot away from that approach. There are times when, hey, a guy was used a bit, and we have to really focus in on that as well, where, hey, oh my gosh, this guy got 14 targets last week. Maybe he's going to be the focal point of an offense. He's still underpriced. There are spots where that can work and it's fine. But more often than not, it's just Justin Jefferson or CeeDee Lamb or somebody else had a great week last week. Let's just chase that one. But meanwhile, there's 5 other names that have similar ceilings in the projections that are massively lower owned because they didn't have a big week last week. So it's really important to understand market inefficiencies. And a lot of that just has to do with what happened the last couple of weeks and people just starting to believe, oh, this guy just sucks. I remember a couple of years back, it was actually Mahomes when he was first starting. I think it was one of the first couple of games he had as a starter with the Chiefs. And I think like game 1 or game 2, something like the first couple games, he didn't throw it to Travis Kelce. And there was Pat Mahomes doesn't have chemistry with Kelce. And all of a sudden everybody's fading Travis Kelce. And then the third week, Travis Kelce goes bonkers and was like, what kind of stupid, like people really faded Kelce because there's no chemistry. What a dumb reason for it, because he didn't throw to him that much last week. What are some sources of inefficiencies? Public bias, overreactions to news, herd mentality, where everybody's just kind of following the same trends or watching the same breakdowns. Part of that, if you think about herd mentality, think about you're watching the DFS shows that week and everybody's on somebody and they're getting everybody else onto that person. That becomes a herd mentality. You know, one of the sites like Roto-Grinders that have like core plays they put out that everybody looks at, all the casuals look at, and all of a sudden those guys go crazy and they get high owned. I look at those to know who to avoid. And we don't want to play those guys where the public is all over a player, high owned leverage. We want to stay away from. Now, what are some strategies that we can employ to exploit these market inefficiencies? So let's get into this. One of the best ways to exploit market inefficiency is through contrarian plays. That means just picking players who are likely to be overlooked by the rest of the DFS community. Now, we've already gotten into that. The best way to identify those players is going to be a combination of projection and ownership. Ownership projection and player projection, right? Starts with ownership. First, let's start with the low-owned players. Now, let's see which one of these players that's low-owned actually has a shot of putting up a big score this week. Maybe, again, it was somebody who's coming off a couple of bad games in a row and no one wants to play. It's like Derrick Henry. It's week 3 of the 2024 season. Henry just didn't have these great games, didn't score touchdowns the first 2 weeks with the Ravens, let's say, right? Here's an example. He then scored a touchdown. Yeah, he put up 88 yards in the first game and got a couple catches, and he put up actually 92 yards in the second game, a couple pass catches, but, disappointed you for DFS. And week 3, like, screw it, I'm not playing, I'm not touching this guy, he sucks, right? Week 3 pretty much does the same thing. Instead of 92 yards, he goes for 101 and gets a touchdown. Well, guess what? That 101 yards was worth 10 points plus another 3-point bonus. That's 13 plus a touchdown. We're at 20. Gets a second touchdown, 26. So he wasn't that far off from actually having a monster score even in the previous week. We saw a lot of this with Rachaad White last season, where he was getting tons of volume in the early weeks, lots of volume, lots of carries, some receptions. He was doing everything you want except for scoring touchdowns. And he had some mediocre scores, but the projection models loved him, but no one wanted to play him. And then, of course, he pops off a few weeks in a row and everybody forgets about all of that. Now, moving on, what are some other ways that we can employ game theory to help our DFS game in 2024? I want to talk a little bit about late swap here and just what that is and how we can utilize it. Now, late swap is a really powerful tool. Basically, it allows us to make last minute adjustments based on either late news or how our lineups are doing in the early going, right? So I'll give some examples of what I do with late swaps. First of all, if my lineup is very, very chalky and the chalk hits in the early game, I'm looking at the late games and high owned players and they all hit. We have to get off that chalk in the second half. So you got to figure everybody else did that, where the field did really well in the early half. So we need to have some low owned players, some shockers in the second half to make up for the fact that we went a little too chalky, and vice versa. If we start up a lineup, this is actually my favorite place to employ late swap is, let's say I took some crazy long shots in the first half of the game, right? I went some wacky bonkers. I started Joe Flacco. He went crazy on the Browns, and I have a stack with Flacco and Njoku and Amari Cooper, and it went nuts at 1% or half 1% ownership. Well, now in the late games, I'm looking at that lineup, and hopefully I have more than one of them, but I'm looking at that lineup going, you know what? I actually want to get a little more chalky in this. I don't need to be so unique. A lot of the chalk in the early half missed. My low owned stack and players all crushed. I want to shift away from risk in the second half of games, get a little more onto some of the chalkier players because I've already got the unique part of my lineup going early. Now, one of the great things we have in DFS Army is the Domination Station Optimizer. And of course, that has late swaps capability. You can late swap hundreds of lineups all in a click of a button across all sports, but it's certainly something you want to utilize when going after the full day, for example, Sunday slate, and just adjusting for what's going on during the game. Now, one of the interesting things I actually also wanted to talk about was reacting to late breaking news, right? So this is all kind of along the lines of market inefficiencies, right? Market inefficiencies that we're going to exploit. One of the biggest ones is late breaking news. And I'm going to give you a scenario that you're going to be really, really familiar with. And I want you to think of what you would do before I kind of talk about what you might want to do instead, right? So it's 12 o'clock, it's 12:30, lock is in half an hour. All of a sudden, a piece of news comes out that starting RB X is not playing. He's out today. Now, the backup RB they don't even do them at 3K anymore on Draftkings, for example. They kind of got rid of the Draftkings, and Fanduel adjusted for this, and we have to adjust as well. So it used to be that you'd get the backup running back for stone min 3K, right? Awesome. Worth it at almost any price. But now Draftkings and Fanduel both price backup RBs with a little thought, with a little nod to that an injury might thrust them into a starting role. So I'll give an example again. We're looking at, the Ravens, and Derrick Henry's out, and now you're getting some combination of Justice Hill and whoever the hell else they have over there, right? As a couple of backs. But I should play Justice Hill now. Derrick Henry is out. But should you? So what if backup RBA or whoever it is, he's going to shoot up his ownership and it's going to be crazy. 30%, 40% owned. He's not even stone min. He's 4,800 and he's splitting touches with a pass catching back or some other guy. So in the end of the day, we rush to play a player that probably isn't even cheap enough to make it worthwhile. That's probably not going to get a full starting role. So instead of going right to the backup running back, I might think, you know what? Derrick Henry's a touchdown scorer, right? Without that guy in there, they're going to have to throw more. Or Lamar Jackson is going to have to run for a touchdown. So a more interesting pivot wouldn't be the direct pivot to the backup running back, but rather it might be, hey, let me stack Lamar Jackson with Mark Andrews, because without their stud running back, they might just switch it up and throw the football a little bit more. So the way that we can exploit market inefficiencies, a big one for me is simply reviewing past contests and trying to understand what happened. When we do back testing at DFS Army, we jump on the optimizer, the domination station, and we can rerun any slate from the last multiple years of NFL. Sunday slate, Saturday afternoon only. We save them all in the optimizer, and we can go back and rerun those slates with the benefit of hindsight. So we can start to understand, all right, first is what won or what wins? What was the situation that week? So for example, when we look at lineups that have won tournaments, was it one QB stacked with one player, QB stacked with two players, two pass catchers? How much leverage? Is it a game stack? Are game stacks working? Was it a team stack? You know, we'll talk about this in another video, but some of the things we've noticed over the years and over the study is, yes, we almost always want to have a quarterback, pretty much always want a quarterback tied with at least one pass catcher. But I think what most people don't realize is quarterbacks are even more leveraged to, for example, their tight end or the WR2 or 3 than they are to the WR1. So somebody like CeeDee Lamb can have a great game, but Dak Prescott just has a pedestrian game. The time when Dak Prescott's game goes bananas, either he runs for touchdowns, or if he's a running quarterback, when CeeDee Lamb and Brandon Cooks and Justin Ferguson or the tight end, you know, some second player get it done. So it's really important to understand what's happened in the past. And at DFS Army, of course, we highly recommend back testing. Every sport that you're going to do, regardless of what it is, if you're going to use the optimizer, especially to mass multi-enter in contests using the domination station optimizer, it is the only optimizer that I know of that has back testing where you can go and rerun those slates with the benefit of hindsight. You can learn, improve. One of the things I tell people is if you can't produce a winning lineup in back test mode, you should not be running the optimizer. You just don't do that. Do a different approach, DFS differently until you figure it out. Okay, I'm comfortable doing the things I need to do to put myself in a position to win. A lot of times that's just fading chalk, making sure you have lots and lots of correlation, but not too much correlation, understanding our sim models and all that stuff, things that can help you win a tournament. So if you're not back testing, you should be doing that. Using tools to your advantage, like for example, at DFS Army, our chalkboard that shows you all the chalky players, the cash players that you really probably want to avoid in tournaments, for example, is a really great tool. And of course, a research station, all the other tools like that. So to recap, game theory and exploiting market inefficiencies are advanced strategies that can significantly boost your DFS success and winnings. By understanding these concepts and applying the strategies we've discussed, you'll be better prepared to crush some DFS in 2024. Now, if you found this video helpful and useful, please make sure to subscribe to this channel, smash that like button, and give us a comment what you do. What would Bobby Wow do in this spot? What do you do to leverage ownership and to give yourself an edge when attacking DFS contests? And what are you doing to prep for the 2024 daily fantasy football season to dominate? So let me know about that. We're going to have some more videos on this topic over the next couple of weeks. We can call it basic training as we prepare for the 2024 NFL season. We want to crush it this year on Draftkings and Fanduel. I hope you'll join us. Again, if you're not signed up at DFS Army as a subscriber, get in there. Now is the time. We are prepping. We're back testing. We're doing everything we need to do to get ready for the season. So make sure you check us out, and I'll see you guys next time.